Let's talk about Descartes. So, um, here's our here's our main guy. Here's the thinker that we're going to discuss this week. We're we're using him as a kind of example of what we'll call the mechanical worldview, the mechanism. And it's this should sound pretty familiar. If you've spent some time learning modern science, for example, the mechanical worldview is largely what you've been sort of steeped in. And it's got a few different aspects. We'll go through them kind of carefully, but Descartes, he thinks everything in the physical material world can be explained and understood based on, the interactions between the smallest parts of the system. That's the that's the kind of basic idea. Um, and only the human soul fails to be explainable in that way. And let me go through this, and we'll sort of. I want to. I'll first got to take a step back to get us from Aristotle to Descartes. That's a big step. It's a millennia and a half or something like that. But we'll go through the difference and the kind of radical change that happens in people's thinking about the material world and therefore the living world by like going through this sort of like mechanistic scientific revolution kind of change. Okay. Okay. And we're going to take a brief detour through. So Descartes is a Christian. Aristotle was not a Christian. We'll go through really briefly Christianity, and Judaism and Islam. They're going to be, I'm sorry, this is going to be incredibly short, but I think it's helpful context. Okay. So, only in the time of Aristotle, only Judaism existed of those three big monotheistic religions. Um, uh, I've heard Jewish friends have described Judaism as a millennia long debate rather than a set of very clear fixed doctrines. But so one way of reading this. So I'll just draw on Kalachowski 2002, hierarchy, kinship, and responsibility, the Jewish relationship to the animal world. And it's a kind of mix of, well, it's not, I think it's not all that different from the Confucian view that we talked about earlier. So um, there's a kind of there's a clear hierarchy of life in the Kalachowski's reading of the Jewish tradition. There's a clear hierarchy. Humans are on top. We are the ones who are in charge of the natural world, and the natural world is in some sense there for us. Um, Nonetheless, there's supposed to be some sense, some feeling of kinship, which comes with a sense of kindness towards animals. Um, there's a humongous debate about all of this, but one strain of the sort of animal rights in Judaism argument goes, when you read Genesis, what you find is um, in the Garden of Eden, God commanded Adam and Eve to only eat plants. It was only after the flood that God gives permission to eat animals. And the Garden of Eden is supposed to be, when things were good, when things were uncorrupted, when things were right as they are, good as they should be. So on this view, the idea is, you know, in a perfect world, we wouldn't be eating animals. Um, and some things got a bit hairy after the flood. The world of the kind of world we inhabit is a corrupted one and a fallen one. But if you were, say, trying to think about how the world should be, and if you got, far easier access to basic calories and nutrition than people did in the time of this kind of like doctrines were being established, maybe we should be moved back towards that kind of perfected state. There's a kind of moral perfection in, it's a in some sense a return to the moral perfection of the Garden of Eden. So that's one way of reading this tradition. Again, huge debates about all of that, but yeah. So yeah, Kalachowski says there's this great big long debate about vegetarianism and Judaism. One version is that it's kind of spiritual ideal. Um, and it's a kind of two-part spiritual idea. It's the spiritually best thing to do on the one hand because it's um basic kindness and the intrinsic worth of animals. On the other hand, it's a reserved way, it's a chaste or restrained way of behaving, which is in almost in the vast majority of spiritual traditions that I'm familiar with, being a little bit restrained is part of having being a spiritual person, right? It's not You're not supposed to just go buck wild and do whatever you want. So, a two-parter. All right. Um, Similar things can be found in Christianity, but the kind of New Testament is pretty clear that eating meat is generally okay. So Romans 14:2 says one person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. So I don't know, that's pretty or 1 Corinthians 10:25, eat anything sold in the meat market. So just go nuts. I mean, there's some restrictions, right? So is Lent coming up? I feel like Lent is coming up. Did that happen already or is that done? Any Catholics in the chat? Um, so for Lent, you're not supposed to eat meat, although fish doesn't count as meat on that view. Yeah, yeah, so it is. Okay, yeah. So there's some restrictions, but it's not, as I understand it, is not generally framed as for the sake of the animals. It's for the sake of you. You're supposed to give up something that you enjoy, so that you can learn restraint and like get away from constant indulgence kind of thing. Once again, I will say there's just a huge variety, and there's no point in trying to talk about Christianity in general. There's just a huge variety of Christian faiths. This is the kind of Catholic view, which before, the 1400s was the main was Catholic and I suppose Orthodox. So yeah, but this is the kind of Catholic canon kind of thing. Okay, so uh, unless there's thoughts on this, do any participants in one of these monotheistic religions have you been taught something else about eating meat out of curiosity, or was that roughly the picture? Okay, so um, we're gonna briefly talk about Islam now, and I think this this one actually feeds directly into the Descartes stuff. Okay, so Western Europe is they're not doing awesome in the kind of like the period from I don't know 500 to 1000 AD or so. Things aren't going super duper well. But in that same period, the Islamic caliphates are growing. So Islam rises in the Middle East, and um, the Islamic caliphates are sort of like the religious political organizations that follow Islam, and they quite a lot of new philosophy and science is done in them, partly because you can see the image here is of near the peak of the sort of geographic expanse of the Islamic caliphates. They took over quite a large chunk of the world in not that much time. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's especially not easy to legitimize yourself in the eyes of the people who you've sort of taken over management of. And they used a venerable old strategy. You see it in, you know, a bunch of the empires that get to this size. They essentially let people keep their dress and religion and food and all that stuff. So they don't force assimilation. But then they engage in this massive project of collecting knowledge from all over the expanse of their empire and kind of like translating it into Arabic to make Arabic a kind of international language of learning, and that access to Arabic, or sorry, access to Arabic language versions of like everything that they can get their hands on, um, brings opportunities for people who are in the kind of center of that to put together new ways of thinking, new syntheses. One of the things they're translating is Aristotle, for example. And Aristotle comes into for new and interesting critiques based on this. So in the kind of like Islamic world, sorry, yeah, like this is a guy Al-Ghazali, 1058 to 1100, 1111, is in, he's a devout Muslim. He's also deeply studied his Aristotle, and like a lot of people, he was sort of trying to see how those two things could fit together, or not fit together. And he produces this critique of Aristotle that's going to, okay, I don't want to make the grand historical claim that he caused the scientific revolution. That's too much. But I will say that he's this critique that he makes is kind of emblematic and a really nice example, and actually was historically influential for the kind of unraveling of the Aristotelian worldview that we talked about last time. So, do you remember last week we talked about Aristotle, and one of the things that Aristotle said was you can just kind of, you see the form of things. You look into the world and you're sober and you're sane and the lighting's good and all that stuff, and you can just get the form of, say, an animal, say the form of a cat, and the cat has a form, and that form is literally goes into my head. My mind is informed by the world, and that gives you access to the necessary relationships between things. So when fire goes up, or to say a piece of cotton catches on fire, for example, a piece of cotton catches on fire, there's a kind of necessary causal relationship between the property, the essence of the fire and the essence of the cotton that causes it to burn. So like when you look at the world, you see the real nuts and bolts of the kind of like you see the joints of nature just by looking carefully with your eyes. So this sort of necessary causal connections between things is something that Aristotle's committed to. And Al-Ghazali is worried about that, because if it's necessary, if it's logically necessary, that means God has no choice in it. God couldn't intervene and say, well, I don't want that to happen this time. In a similar way that God couldn't make 2 plus 2 equals 5. It seems like a limit on God's power, and Al-Ghazali, as a committed Muslim, is not happy with that. So he's a little worried about this idea that causal connections are necessary. And he asks himself, and he asks his readers in The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he says, is that a necessary connection? And if it's necessary, how can you tell? What the basic argument is something like what is it in your senses that tells you, say that you hit a billiard ball and it knocks a bunch of other billiard balls around the table. What in your sensory experience uh, is necessary in that? What would be the difference between seeing that just happen to go that way versus seeing it being necessary? Like, did you actually see the cue ball cause the other balls to move, or did you see the cue ball move and then the other balls move? He thinks that you just saw one thing happen and then another thing happen. You didn't see that it was a necessary connection. And Aristotle tells us that you do see that. He says, look, you can just see the essence of things, and those essences of things tell you exactly how things work. You just see it. And Al-Ghazali goes, do you? I don't see that. I see one thing happening and another thing happening. I didn't see that it was necessary. And I mean, generally speaking, what do you think? Like, I don't think I see the necessary connections between things either. Once you point it out, you're like, oh yeah, I don't actually see that. You infer it, you reason your way to it. But that's something added on to your sensory experience. It's not something that you literally see in the world. So this is part of the kind of like this style of critique. Is that convincing to chat? Is that convincing? Does that sound right to you? like I find it utterly convincing. Like, no, I don't just see the structure of reality. I see a bunch of stuff happening, and I infer that there are hidden causes, but that I might be mistaken. I might have the causes wrong. I might not understand what I'm seeing. And yeah, a lot of contextual inferred. Was it the this idea that led to God saying God interferes at every instance to cause events? Yes, that's correct. So Al-Ghazali was called an occasionalist. Al-Ghazali's conclusion from this is literally every time you see one thing appear to cause another thing, God intervenes to create that connection. So when the cue ball goes to the rack and knocks a bunch of the other balls around, God has to be there to sort of like make sure that the causal sequence follows. And then when there's a miracle, that's God just sort of deciding not to do the thing he usually does. That's occasionalism. Yeah. What do I mean this? Well, so what do I mean by the structure of reality? So I mean the way things have to interact with each other. So remember Aristotle's thing about like rocks fall down because they're trying to return to their proper place in the universe. That's you might call that the structure of reality. I mean, partly the interesting thing here is we're watching a this is the first crack in Aristotle's view of what it means to be the structure of reality. Right. So um and we'll talk what after we'll take a break in a little bit, but after the break we'll talk about a new way of thinking about what the structure of reality really is that comes out of mechanism. Okay, so the question is, but cotton wouldn't be able to burn without fire touching it, so it is still kind of necessary to have both fire and cotton. Yeah, that's right. It's necessary. You don't get fire is a necessary thing for burning, but the thing that Aristotle's saying is much stronger. Is that anytime you touch fire and cotton together, it will necessarily burn. So that the effect is not just that the cause is necessary for the effect, but the effect is necessary given the cause. You will always get these causal relations. The fire will always go up, rocks will always fall down, cotton will always burn. That any way in which things are connected is is sort of like built into the logic of reality. And Al-Ghazali's just like, is it? Or is it just that we see it happen over and over again? So we get used to it and we think it's necessary, but maybe conceptually it could have been a different way. Good. That's good to clarify. Yeah. So, all right. Okay. So, Al-Ghazali, the point of all that was there's a bunch of interesting new ideas developing in the Islamic world, and the limits of Aristotle's thinking start to appear. That's around when people start to get a notion that like, oh, okay, this really nice, neat package of Aristotle's ideas, there's some worries here. There's some reason to be worried. Okay. Very briefly on Islam and animals. I mean, the picture is substantially similar to in Christianity and Judaism. So, from this on animal rights and welfare in Islam, according to Islamic teachings, animals have specific position and purpose in the creation hierarchy. So again, we have this notion of a kind of hierarchical picture of our relationship to the natural world. Fundamentally, they have been created to fulfill the multiple needs of mankind. On the other hand, humans have been directed not to waste the lives of animals and are held responsible for their well-being and feed. So like Islam in the kind of uh, rules of conduct given by Islam, there's a whole bunch of stuff on what you're not allowed to do to animals or with animals. You're not allowed to use them for target practice. You're not allowed to make them fight each other for sport. You're not allowed to beat them in the face. It's it's maybe indicative of the times in which Islam arose that somebody felt the need to write that stuff down. Like you're not don't don't use animals for target practice for fun. And like the fact that that was a rule that they needed to have suggests that people were using animals for target practice for fun. Um, and this was forbidden by Islam. So and like halal the rules of what makes meat halal include rules about like how you're allowed to slaughter an animal. That were the basic idea was it's a less cruel way of slaughtering the animals than whatever else other people were doing at the time. So, but again, we got this. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam. We've got like you're supposed to be nice to animals. You're not supposed to cause suffering for the sake of suffering in animals. Partly for the animal's sake, partly because it's not a good way to be as a human being. Just causing wanton suffering is like you're not living the spiritual life. But there's a clear hierarchy. There's a clear hierarchy between humans and animals. We are the more important types of being. And so we saw that kind of hierarchical thing with Confucianism, but in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's a more metaphysical reason why. It's that we have literally like the great chain of being. This is the last slide, and we'll take 10, but like there's a chain, the great chain of being is the way the Christians talked about it. Um, at the top is God, of course. God is the most important thing in the universe. And then just below him are angels. Angels are made of spirit. They are not made of matter. They're made of spirit. They're unchangeable. Below them are humans. We are the mix of spirit and matter. So we've got a material nature, we've got a spiritual nature. We're the kind of like slightly uncomfortable middle ground between the two. And then animals and plants and minerals are just matter. So we participate in the divine essence in a way that animals don't on this view. There's something about us, call it a soul, that is the same stuff as angels and God, that is not possessed by animals. So it's a very clear hierarchy. It's not just based on our degree of kinship. It's based on a belief in the kind of like deep structure, again, deep structure of reality. I know that's an unclear phrase, but something about the nature of reality means that we are more important than animals, is the view. Yeah. Okay. And then we'll see that. Birds are above sea life, which are above land animals. Is that right? Maybe. They're physically above us. That's a good question, and I don't actually know. So there are fine gradations between these that I don't actually know the details of. I do know that the um yeah kings and queens are meant to be above us non-nobles. They are closer to God. Um, but yeah, actually the arrangement of animals, I'm not sure about that. That's a good question. Okay. Yeah, I'll look that up. Okay, but shall we take a break? Shall we take 7 minutes, stretch our legs, come back and talk about Descartes? Okay, so far we've gotten from Aristotle to the kind of view that was present in the big three monotheistic religions. Um, yeah, yeah, we kind of did this. Things got shaken up a little bit. So there's this notion that like this idea of a hierarchy of being was not just about our relationship with animals. It was also about the kind of like it, it's connected with an idea about how societies should be organized. So kings and queens are the closest to God on the great chain of being, and their proper place in the universe is to rule us. And I say I assume none of you are direct. If anybody here is direct nobility, this doesn't apply to you, but for the rest of us, our proper place in the universe is to serve kings and queens, just as like animals' proper place in the universe is to feed us. Um, yeah. Uh, there's the literally like in the Aristotelian worldview, which is still present. Like Aristotle is still this notion of like how the solar system is structured was still present in kind of medieval pre-Renaissance Christianity. Um, There's a kind of hierarchy in the heavenly spheres. The stars are the perfect things. They're composed of quintessence, and they stay perfect. Whereas we are we're at the center of the universe. We're also kind of at the worst place in the universe because the the four elements are all mixed up and stuff. Um, this kind of gets shaken up in the 14th century. There was the bubonic plague that killed something like a third of the population of Europe and quite significant portions of the population in the Middle East and Asia. There was the Hundred Year Wars in 1337 to 1453. Don't worry about there's a rounding errors there. Don't worry about it. And then the Catholic Church schisms in 1378, which means that people start breaking off. The Protestants start breaking off from the Catholic Church, and an endless series of wars starts going. And I mean the thing about all of that stuff is traditional notions of how the social hierarchy works started to look shaky. When there are too many peasants and not enough land, the person who owns the land, which is the nobles, had all the power. When a third of the population dies and the same amount of land is there, um, suddenly the people who work the land have a lot more choice. You can go somewhere. If you got a bad deal from your local nobility, you can go somewhere else and get a better deal. So the way that sort of social hierarchy was organized gets a little shaken up by all that. Um, there's a bunch of sort of scientific shakeups as well. So famously Copernicus. Copernicus is a beneficiary of in this period the Christian Crusades start, and one of the places that they take is Spain, which had been part of the Islamic caliphates. And in Spain, and through a variety of sort of like more peaceful sort of trade and discussions, the Christian world rediscovers a whole bunch of stuff. Um, well, not rediscovers. They not only rediscovers, they learn a whole bunch of stuff. Arabic numerals, for example, the ones that I wrote numbers with on this slide, super duper helpful if you want to do quick calculations and stuff like that. The abacus, improved calculation techniques and improved methods of doing observations. Huge amounts of stuff get imported into Europe in this period that kind of loosens things up. We get printing press from China. We get the compass, just like massive amounts of stuff as the kind of like European colonialist project gets ramping up. One of the things that's getting imported into Europe is a whole bunch of new ideas and techniques. And some of the beneficiaries include people like Copernicus, who sort of like restructures our idea of the solar system. Nobody cared when Copernicus said it, but by the time of Galileo, people started to sort of take notice, and Newton particularly. Okay. Um, Galileo starts doing this thing where, remember I said with Aristotle, there's no math in his physics. Aristotle does physics without math. But Galileo starts using math to do, we say terrestrial physics, which is physics on of stuff on the Earth. He starts sort of representing the way things change over time in terms of mathematical relations. This the image here is geometric. Once Descartes comes around, we the algebraic and geometric get merged together. Um, and this creates sort of mathematizing the world, applying math to the natural world, encourages a way of seeing matter where you distinguish what are called primary and secondary qualities. So the primary qualities are there even when you're not looking. The table has four legs, whether you're looking at it or not, right? It has a certain weight, a certain shape. It's made of a certain material. All of those things are true of it, whether you're looking at it or not. Secondary qualities, like does a table have color, whether does a table have color in the dark? And like, not really, right? Not really. For there to be an experience of color, you need an experiencer. For it to have a smell, you need to have somebody who smells it. There are features of the world that seem to be like out there in the world and are subject to math, and features of the world that seem to be relative to an observer. And once people like Galileo start applying math to the natural world, this becomes a relevant distinction between the stuff that is in some sense objectively there and the stuff that is just part features of our experience. And I want you to think back all the way to think back all the way to Al-Ghazali. You can see the results of this fissure that starts to appear in Aristotle, where we're like, is that in the world or is it in my experience? Right? This is what Al-Ghazali wants us to ask Aristotle. Aristotle allowed huge amounts of stuff to just be in the world, the purposes and goals and essences and stuff. And Al-Ghazali starts this sort of like, is that in the world or is that in my experience? And by the time we get to, say, Galileo, the bits that you can apply math to seem like there really are in the world. The bits that you can't are questionable. Or it's like, until you can figure out how to make it mathematical, maybe it's not really there in the world. Maybe it's a feature of our experience. So this distinction between primary and secondary qualities starts to be drawn. And the kind of pinnacle of this distinction is what the topic of this week, the mechanical worldview. That is, the only things that are really out there in the world are the mechanical properties of it. Um, there's no purposes in the world. There's no meaning. Those are secondary qualities. Those are things that we apply to it. Um, and really, the only thing that's out there in the world is extension, I'd say. So, um, you know, uh, the mechanical philosophy, this philosophy of the scientific revolution, this way of thinking about what's in the world, what the structure of reality is, if you will, says the only real primary quality, the only thing that's really, really out there is the shape of things. Extension is just like out the shape of it in space. And in the purest version of this philosophy, matter really only has one real objective primary property: extension. All matter is a shape that excludes other matter. All it can do, it's only got one real property: its shape, its extension in space, and it's only really got one power, which is to exclude other matter. If you bump into something, it bounces away. So that's what I mean by excluding other matters. Like, you can't two physical objects can't overlap. And that's a pretty profound sort of stripping down of what we think is out there in the world. It's a pretty profound reduction in what you're willing to admit is out there rather than in our heads. So, and to bring this back again to Aristotle, Aristotle had these four causes, and you can see the mechanical philosophy kind of throws out three of them. Material is sort of still there, but there's only one kind of material, so there's no point in sort of explaining anything based on it. It's just matter, and matter just excludes other matter. And there's no forms anymore. There's just matter in various shapes, and there's certainly no purposes out there in the world. If there are purposes, if there are essences, those are things that we apply. Those are things in our head, not things out there in the world. Oh, it's a very deep reduction in the what we think is out there. Okay. Okay, so let me now introduce this debate between these two guys, Descartes and Hobbes. Um, these guys are both mechanists. They both believe in the mechanical philosophy that I just described. They both think that science, to do science, is to explain things mechanically, and anything else is not really science. Hobbes takes this, as far as I can tell, as far as it's possible to take this, which he says, so, you know, the world is just matter bouncing around, bumping around, uh, and that applies to us as well. That applies to, say, thinking. Thinking ultimately should be just something that you can explain in terms of matter excluding other matter mechanisms. Um, yeah, sorry, a question in the chat. Couldn't the sight of the physical table be something we need to experience? We wouldn't know the table was there if we didn't see it. So how could we know it exists? That's correct. So we learn about the primary properties of things through our experiences. That's exactly right. But the idea is that even if we hadn't seen it, it would still be true that the table has four legs and a flat top. That's the distinction. Whereas, it's a kind of a tree falling in the woods. If the tree falls in the woods, does it really make a sound? The mechanical philosophy people would say, well, not kind of no, because sound is an experience. Sound is our perception of how things go, whereas it really does fall down. So the primary property is the tree standing up or is the tree falling down? The secondary property of like what does it sound like? That's just in our heads. So yeah, we only ever access the primary properties of things through our perception, and our perceptions are often unreliable in that sense. We can't be sure of what they're telling us. We need to sort of do careful experiments, for example, and note how different that is from Aristotle. If you're trying to get at the kind of hidden objective properties of things, and all you got are your unreliable senses, you need to do a bunch of careful experiments to see what's really there. Whereas for Aristotle, you could just directly get the essences of things. And guess which one of those is going to be a better strategy, a better heuristic for doing science? Can you just trust your intuitions, or do you have to do careful experiments? And when people stopped trusting their intuitions and started thinking that our senses are a kind of unreliable guide to what's really there, they started doing more productive science. Um, yeah. We might have gone too far in that direction. We might want to bring back some of that intuition stuff, but that it seems to have been a very fruitful research strategy for the 1500s, 1600s. Um, I believe the tree argument was the one that was debunked for the Nobel Prize last year. I'm not familiar with this. Drop a link in the chat if you can. Okay, so um, mechanism goes pretty far, but note that this is happening in the context of Christianity. They've still got this notion that, I mean, there's still feudalism. There's still this idea that humans are the top of the hierarchy and that nobles are above us, regular humans, I guess. There's still this notion of an immaterial soul. So when Hobbes says thinking is just like we're meat machines, that's a pretty radical thing to say. And Descartes disagrees with him. He thinks that thinking is the one thing in the physical world, in the material world, that you can't explain mechanically. So, all right. So this is Cartesian dualism. Cartesian just means of Descartes. So Descartes' thing is um, we've got nothing is really real. Okay. Um, we've got bodies that are mechanical. We've got bodies that are mechanical. They are governed by mechanical principles, and anything about your body you can explain mechanically in terms of just matter excluding other matter, except thinking. And Descartes thinks he's got arguments to show that, in fact, you cannot explain or understand thinking mechanically. It's impossible in this sense to create a machine that can think, is one of the predictions of this theory. Oh, that's cool. There's a here. I'll put the this was sent in a private message, but here's the nothing is locally real. The 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics. Uh, Neat. Okay. Okay. So, uh, dualism is this idea that um, the physical world is entirely mechanical except the human soul, and the human soul is the thing that thinks. So there's a fundamentally different kind of stuff that is the soul, and that's the bit that does the consciousness. It does thinking. It's the bit that survives after death. Um, the difference between this and a different idea. Substance dualism is not the idea that there's a kind of like a soul that is physical. So here's what it's not. In 1901, a physician called Duncan McDougall tried to measure the weight of the soul. So as a person is he weighs a person before they die and just after they die. He claimed to have done it. I think he said the soul weighed about 11 grams or so. I don't think that that's true. And Descartes would have to say that it's not true. Descartes thinks that the soul is non-material. Um, if there's a soul particle, if your soul has a kind of any kind of physical substance, it can't be. That's not Cartesian dualism. Cartesian dualism is the idea that the soul is a fundamentally different kind of matter. So the soul, the mind or the soul for the substance dualism has no weight, no location, no size, no shape. Those are all features of matter. Minds are totally non-physical. Okay, so why does Descartes think any of that? Well, he thinks that there are good Descartes gives us some arguments. He thinks that you simply can't explain the kinds of things that human minds can do in terms of mechanisms. So, here's an argument. Here's one of Descartes' arguments for the dualism. This idea that the mind is a fundamentally different kind of stuff than matter. Okay. Premise one. Reasoning is truth tracking. If you're reasoning, it should be the case that what you're doing has something to do with what's true, right? So far, so good. Okay. Evaluating truth requires understanding meaning, right? If I say, if you're trying to figure out whether a sentence is true, that means you have to understand what it means, right? Okay. But the whole thing that we just said, well, okay, Aristotle had all this kind of like meaning and purpose and all that in the world, and then the scientific revolution says nothing like that is in the world. All that's out there in the world are physical objects with extension. Well, there's no meaning in that. That's just shapes. The shapes don't have meaning. We apply meaning to them. Therefore, no purely physical process could be truth tracking. Huh? What do you think? You go through it again. So, um, if you're reasoning, you're thinking about trying to decide whether something makes sense, is rational, or is true. That means that you should understand the meaning of what you're talking about. You're not just mechanically operating. You're not just mechanically manipulating symbols, right? But there's no meaning in the world. Purely physical systems there's no sense of meaning in them. Therefore, anything that reasons can't be purely physical. Huh? What do you think? Huh? Yeah, okay, makes sense to me. Okay, good, good. Okay, great. We're dualists now. If you don't want to be a substance dualist, you got to find some way to reject this. Just to note. I mean, if this argument works, that means that your ability to reason cannot possibly be explained materially and mechanically. That means there can be no science of, for example, psychology. Why do we necessarily accept the last premise? Isn't it Aristotelian? No. It's the last thing is the opposite of Aristotelian. So Aristotle says there is meaning in the world. Aristotle's happy with the idea that the world is rich with things like meaning. But we rejected that. It's mechanistic. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's a good it's so the way to defeat this would be to find a way to encode meaning in physical properties. So like um find a way to mechanically encode meaning. So does an LLM understand the meaning of its sentences? Is one way of putting this question. Does AI understand the sentences, the meaning of its sentences, or doesn't it? The argument here is it's impossible in principle for it to understand meaning. Now, he doesn't, I mean, he just kind of says that that's impossible. It's a kind of like, well, I mean, like, how would you even do that style argument? Um, you can defeat that argument by creating a machine that does understand meaning. And I think, you know, uh, it's becoming harder and harder every year to deny that there are machines that can track meaning. You might want to say that they're like conscious or that they have a soul or something, but it's becoming harder to deny. Exactly what it you can no longer just go like, well, obviously there's no machines that understand meaning. I don't think that's obvious anymore. You have to provide some kind of argument now. But okay. Okay. Good. Here's Descartes. He says, "It is not conceivable that such a machine should produce different arrangements of words so as to give an appropriately meaningful answer to whatever is said in its presence, as the dullest of men can do." Um, that one might not hold up. That one, the argument here is just it's simply not possible to give context appropriate responses with words. It's simply not impossible for a machine to do that. And like, we maybe need a different argument now. This might not be a winning argument anymore, Descartes. Um, yeah. All right. Okay, but here's another one. Here's a different line of argument, completely separate one. The argument from doubt. So here's again to keep clear on what we're arguing for. Descartes trying to argue that there is a fundamentally different kind of thing that is your mind. Minds are not material. They are a different kind of stuff. So here's his argument. This is probably more famous argument. Argument from doubt in the Meditations. Has anybody? If you take first year philosophy, you've taken this. Anybody read this stuff before? The Meditations by Descartes? No? Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So this will be familiar. All right. So here's the argument. Something like this. Um, can you can you imagine that you're having a dream right now? Like you're presumably listening to this lecture. You're in a physical space. Are you certain that this isn't all a dream? It would be a dull dream. I hope your dreams are more interesting than this, but like, is it possible? I think, yeah, I guess it's possible. I guess it's possible. Yes, I'm certain I'm not dreaming. Okay, good. Okay. How? How are you certain? That seems like an ambitious claim. Not just are you certain, but should you be certain? I guess is a stronger version of this question. Should you be certain that you're not dreaming? Um, yeah, dreams are not this vivid. You can have but that's not always true, isn't it? You can have extremely vivid dreams. Lucid dreamers report extremely vivid dreams. Also, um, when you're in the dream, you don't notice that it's not. You generally speaking don't notice that all of the missing details and stuff like that. Anyway, okay, so um, good. These are good. Um, yeah, because we can't directly perceive the reality like the brain creates an image of the world. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we're not certain. Let's suppose. Let's give Descartes this one. Not for real, but for the sake of argument, let's suppose that we're not certain that this is not in fact a dream, or a hallucination created by an evil demon or something. So we're not actually sure that our bodies are in the places that we think they are, or in the posture that we think they are. And in fact, you can have a dream where your body is different than the one you really have. So are you certain that you have the body that you think you do? Descartes says no. Okay. But we know your mind. How do you know that you have a mind? How do you know even that you have a body? Is how do you know that you have a body? He says, well, you can't be certain of that. How do you know you have a mind? Well, you have direct access to that, he thinks. You know that kind of immediately and certainty. You can doubt that you have any particular body. You can, but you can't doubt that you have a mind. Therefore, minds and bodies are different. Okay, that last move was pretty sneaky. That last move was a little. You should be mad about that last little bit that I just said. So we have different ways of yeah, we have different levels of certainty about these two things, therefore they can't be identical metaphysically, is the argument. I don't know. I don't know. Um, yeah, it's a leap. Yeah, and that is a leap. Um, yeah. Just briefly, if you want the counter argument to that, um, you could say You're sitting in a room with Clark Kent. You say, I know that I can see Clark Kent right now, but I don't know that I can see Superman. Therefore, Clark Kent and Superman can't be the same person. That was a terrible argument. That obviously doesn't work. So probably this one doesn't work either. I'm not going to give you any like really awesome arguments for substance dualism today. I don't think that there are any. But those are, the mechanical reasoning one is the closest one. This is I find unsatisfying personally, but anyway, just to give you a flavor of the kind of things that he thinks. Okay, so uh roughly why Descartes thinks that minds and bodies are fundamentally different. Now, what does he think that that means particularly for animals? Um so the reading was from a chapter from Anthropocentrism and its Discontents. And the overall message was something like, um, given everything that I've said so far, I've been giving you the setup for this. Descartes thinks that animals should get essentially no moral consideration. Um, none at all for their own sake. Um, you can do whatever you want to animals. Is Descartes' takeaway? Uh, there's some there's some debate about this, and Steiner goes through the debate. Um, he's unconvinced by people. Some people have wanted to sort of like say, "Oh no, he can't possibly think that, right? He can't possibly think that should get no moral consideration." And Steiner says it is though current defenders of Descartes simply cannot believe that he held a view that is repugnant by contemporary standards, so they attempt to revise Descartes to make his views acceptable by those standards. And like he really did have I don't know anybody who would go to bat for Descartes' view of how animals should be treated. He, for example, did stuff like um, vivisections on animals, which is dissecting them while they're still alive, to see how they worked. Um, and you should not do that. That's morally wrong. But he says stuff like, "Yeah, I know that they make all these horrible noises when you're cutting them apart while they're still alive. Those are just reflexes. Those are produced mechanically, and they remind us of real suffering from humans. But all that is a bunch of mechanical reflexes." And he explains this a lot. He does quite a bit of physiology. And tries to cancel Descartes. Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, no, nobody should believe this about animals. That's just repugnant by even. So I mean, we started with a kind of Judeo-Christian view that we are like morally superior to animals and that we are the really important ones. But even by those standards, Descartes' a little extreme. Um, yeah, he's just like nothing. They get nothing, no consideration whatsoever. In exactly the same way that you wouldn't give moral consideration to a watch, you should give no moral consideration to animals. Okay. Okay. So, um, Descartes tries to explain why animals look like they are aware and sentient and all that because they've got what he calls animal spirits, and it's very important that you get that it's spirits in the sense of alcohol, not spirits in the sense of ghosts. He thinks that it's a kind of subtle fluid in the nerves that transmits signals from one part of the body to another. And the movement of animal spirits, we have animal spirits in us as well. The movement of animal spirits causes reflexes and all that. So everything that an animal does, Descartes thinks, is explainable in terms of complicated and exquisitely designed and all that, but reflexes. And we have some reflexes too, but then we also have voluntary actions initiated by our soul. Here's Descartes quoted in Steiner. When people take a fall and stick out their hands so as to protect their head, it is not reason that instructs them to do this. It is simply that the sight of the impending fall reaches the brain and sends the animal spirits into the nerves in the manner necessary to produce the movements even without any mental volition, just as it would be produced in a machine. Notice how I ran out of breath in that sentence? That sentence is too long. That's a run-on sentence. Okay, and since our own experience reliably informs us that this is so, why should we be so amazed that the light reflected from the body of a wolf onto the eyes of a sheep should be equally capable of arousing the movements of light in the sheep? So when a sheep runs away from a wolf, That's just like when you pull your hand away from a fire or stick your hand out when you're falling to brace yourself. You've got reflexes that don't involve reason. Why should you be so surprised that animals have them too? Furthermore, animals don't have souls, and therefore they're just reflexes. They are just mechanisms. All right. Um, People pointed out the flaws in this basic view pretty much immediately. Almost immediately, people came up with devastating counter objections to this. One of Descartes' students. So Descartes had a good gig as a tutor to Elizabeth of Bohemia. So he was teaching her science and philosophy and stuff. And like, I, just sorry, I should say Descartes is an incredibly smart guy. I'm being mean to him. He comes up with Cartesian geometry. He makes huge leaps in like a bunch of areas in science and math and philosophy. This particular view was a bit of a non-starter. So he's teaching Elizabeth of Bohemia about his theories about mind-body dualism, and she writes him a letter, says, Descartes, please tell me please how the soul of a human being, it being only a thinking substance, can determine the bodily spirits, and so bring about voluntary actions. Okay, so all of this was like Descartes says the mind is fundamentally a different kind of stuff than the matter. Um, it's radically different. It has no location, it has no weight, it has no extension whatsoever. But also somehow it guides our voluntary actions. And Elizabeth of Bohemia goes, "Oh, how? How could that be the case?" And he has no good answer. He has no good answer. Um, yeah. Descartes suggests the mind and body interact via the pineal gland. Uh, like, I don't know. He liked the pineal gland because or the pineal gland because it's one of the few structures in the brain that doesn't have two versions of it on either side. There's just one right in the middle, and it's kind of roughly in the middle of the brain. So the soul interacts with the body through the pineal gland. Does that answer the question that Elizabeth Bohemia raised for Descartes? No, no, it doesn't. Not at all. Not at all. Not even a little. And as far as I know, he has nobody, as far as I know, thinks that he has a good answer for this. Um, so this mind body dualism of this substance dualism, I don't know of any way of saving it from this quite devastating objection that was raised almost immediately. Um, yeah. There's a couple of attempts. There's some attempts. So Leibniz, here's two ways perhaps that you can be a substance dualist and not be subject to this thing from Bohemia, Elizabeth Bohemia is called the interaction problem. Here's some ways of doing it. So Leibniz has a suggestion. Leibniz also again crazy smart. He invents calculus for pity's sake. So these are very very smart people. Leibniz proposes what's called parallelism. The mind and body are indeed, as Descartes says, separate substances, but the mind and body don't actually interact. In the beginning, God created matter and God created souls, and He lined things up just right to make it look like when I have a kind of when I do something voluntary, like I think I want to raise my hand, I have the volition, I want to raise my hand, and at the same time, my hand raises up, but one of those things didn't actually cause the other. They're just operating. So the material world and the mental worlds operate in parallel, and they're just like very just in the same way that two clocks can show the same time without one causing anything in the other. This is parallelism. I don't know. I don't know. It's a way of being a dualist without having the interaction problem. So if for independent reasons you were committed to dualism and you think that the interaction problem is a deep one, and it is, then maybe you're attracted to parallelism as a way of understanding minds and bodies. Um, my main question here is what's the matter for? What's why do you need if if the mind is going to act as though matter is doing stuff, um, what do you need matter for? I don't see what seems superfluous. Anyway, yeah. Here's another one. Here's another one from Malebranche, and in fact, this is we earlier discussed Al-Ghazali's occasionalism. Sort of Malebranche is one of the kind of followers of Descartes, but he's worried about the interaction problem. He suggests the following: minds and bodies are indeed separate substances. This is substance dualism. However, whenever it seems like a physical event is causing a mental event, or vice versa, God did it. God is stepping in. So when I say I want to raise my hand, there's a mental event of my voluntary action, try to raise my hand, and then my hand does in fact raise, and that I mean God made sure that those two things happen, and it's sort of parallelism, but instead of just sort of like a pre-established harmony, it's God kind of going in between all the time. Malebranche, like Al-Ghazali, thinks that all physical interactions are like this too. So anytime anything looks like it's causing anything else, God voluntarily makes that so. And God is both matter and spirit. God's everything. God's omnipotent. So God can do it. Huh? There you go. So you too can be a substance dualist and not have to worry about the interaction problem if you simply accept parallelism or occasionalism. Any questions? Any objections? Are we happy with all that? I don't know. Isn't this just Christianity? Well, so you do if you think that there is a soul that survives the body. So suppose you're one version of this, one version of Christianity says that there's a soul, an immaterial soul that survives the death of the body. That resurrection is not a matter of your body coming back together. That is literally just your soul existing something somewhere else. Then you need some sort of story about this. You need some sort of story. Yeah. Yeah, if you believe in a world of spirit that is independent of the world of matter, you're gonna have to do something about this stuff. Um, yeah. There's another question in the chat. Isn't then God is responsible for the bad things people do as well? Yeah. Yeah. Think of the grossest thing you've ever done. That was God. That was God helped. But that's a larger problem. So that's a question of the problem of evil and why would God let us be bad? Malebranche actually has a answer to that. Malebranche's answer is something like God created general rules for how reality should work, and those rules produce the best possible outcomes while still preserving simplicity. So the God created sort of simple general rules for running reality, and he created the best simple general rules that he could that that produce the most good outcomes, but there's going to be some bad outcomes, and he'd have to like micromanage, like he'd have to make a whole bunch of decisions about what should happen on a moment by moment basis if he was going to make sure that nothing really bad happened. And that he doesn't want to God doesn't want to do that. He does this kind of go between thing, but he doesn't really have to think about it because it's just like, oh, I'll just kind of follow the rule. I'll just keep following the rules. But if he wanted to get rid of all bad stuff from happening, he'd have to come up with new rules on the fly all the time. And God wanted to create simple general rules that nonetheless produce the best outcomes. So there's Malebranche's answer to the problem of evil. It would have been more paperwork to create a universe without evil in it. Short version. Yeah. Hmm. All right. Okay. So all right. Um, so why am I telling you all this? One, so that you can be a generally educated person and you can know about the history of ideas. Two, because I think there's a really deep sense in which this mechanism is not something that we're rid of. Uh, like the thing that kept any of this from being in Descartes' view, like the thing that kept any of it from being a total kind of like I don't know, moral nihilism or something like that was his conviction that there is, in fact, something special about us. He gives up the idea that there's anything morally important about the natural world, morally important about animals or plants or anything like that. We are the one exception for Descartes that remains morally important, and it's only because we have these immaterial souls. And I worry that one of the reasons why why humanity's in the position that it is because a whole lot of people took up that basic idea and then slowly let the idea of the soul fade away. And what we have is a kind of mechanism that just says, no, things are just grinding through their mechanical properties, and there is no meaning anywhere, and there is no value or moral worth anywhere. Um, and then you get what the world is like now. This is a worry that I have. I'm not proposing that as a kind of a thing I'm certain about, but like it might be part of the story of how the world got to be the way it is. We got very, very good at manipulating the mechanisms of nature, but we did that by kind of ignoring or saying that there's just nothing else but the mechanisms. I don't know. Yeah, that's so mechanism as a way of seeing the living world has been popular since the kind of scientific revolution. Um, Although we'll talk about next week was um, ways in which biology has always been less than perfectly aligned with it. So um, we'll talk about and in the 20 we'll take this up again in the kind of 20th century where the idea is, I mean, there's quite a large number of biologists, especially in the 20th century, who said stuff like, we are simply the mechanical outcomes of our genes. Our genes programmed us to be the way we are. We simply act out those programs. That the mechanism there is sort of genetic, and that yeah, that's what existence is like. And we'll see a kind of debate between um, that kind of picture of biology and one that says that no, we are that at least mechanism by itself is not enough to understand the way we are. And the leftover is something like self-organization. We are self-organized entities where the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and that's why a purely mechanical way of thinking about us is insufficient. That's a whole big. I teach a third year course where that's the whole course as we talk about that, so it's a fairly large topic. But I want to give you next week a kind of slice of this debate where how do we think in the 21st century about life? And I think it's reasonable to think, there remains a debate about whether we are simply mechanical or whether mechanism as an explanatory strategy and a research strategy has its limits. Yeah, so we'll do that next week. Okay. The third year course is Complexity, Order, and Emergence, HPS 322. Complexity, order, and emergence. Yeah, and we talk quite a lot about um, mechanism and self-organization, life, and how do you explain it and understand it and all that stuff. That's the overall topic. Yeah. Okay. Um, all right. That's everything I had for today. Thanks, everyone. Next time we'll talk about mechanism and genes. I will leave the chat open for another few minutes if anybody else wants to. I've got a good number of discussion questions this week. Thank you so much. Um, and I'll post some of them up for tutorials. Yeah, if you weren't here at the very beginning, the exam, I have been convinced, is non-cumulative. We'll just do since the midterm. That does put, thank you, thank you. I am not too badly off, but I do need to stop talking soon. Um, yeah. Um, it puts a lot of weight on the last two lectures next week and the week after. So maybe come to those. Maybe come to those. That would be a good idea. Which they will. I'm committed to making sure that they are not online, that they will be in person. Okay. All right. Thanks everyone. Thanks for putting up with the online thing. I know that it's annoying. I would far prefer to see you in person, but here we are. All right. Have a good one.